There's some terminology, some basic terms that are associated with the sine curve, the graph of this function f of x equals sine of x, the sine curve and the cosine curve. And so we're going to take a look at these. One word is periodic. A function is periodic. A function is periodic if there is a finite interval over which the function repeats itself. The graph of the function values repeat themselves. And so we can see that in this case, yes, this does repeat itself. The question is, what is the distance? This is periodic. It does repeat itself. There are many phenomena in nature that have this quality. The cycle of day and night repeats itself. The cycle of amount of daylight on the earth repeats itself as the earth goes around the sun in solar orbit. The actual seasons themselves repeat themselves. There are cycles. The heartbeat repeats itself. It resets and repeats. There are many the graph, the course, the position of a pendulum as it swings back and forth can be represented by this periodic kind of behavior. And so these and many others are used, the sine curve and the other trigonometric functions, to represent them because they are also periodic and they can be used to model these real world circumstances. So this is a periodic function. A periodic function has a period. Now, I'm not going to get perfect, precise definitions. The textbook is loaded with them. So you are more than free, more than able to read the textbook and find out a perfect, precise definition. What I want to do is have you all know what I mean when we say the word. So if I use the period on an exam, then you know what that word means. You need to have a working understanding, not necessarily an exact, precise definition. But the period is this. It is the minimum distance required for this curve to repeat itself. The minimum distance. Well, we can see that here, 0 to 2 pi, that repeats itself. But notice, if I start at negative pi, it goes down, up, down, and then it goes up, down. If I go from negative pi to 3 pi, it also repeats itself. And then if I take this piece of the picture and then move over and close it back in the picture, that's going to repeat itself exactly as it goes out. And so the question is the distance required 2 pi or is it 4 pi? Well, the period is the minimum distance. And so if I take this piece of the picture, cut it out, pick it up, move it over, pull it back, it would be the precise image. If I take this piece of the picture, pick it up, move back over this way and plug it back in, it fits exactly the same picture. And so the period is the minimum distance required for this curve to repeat itself. For the sine curve, that distance is 2 pi. The period is 2 pi. The period is not, I say again, not. The period is not 0 to 2 pi or anything like that. The period is a number. It is not an interval. It is a number. Yes, there is a correspondence between this and this, but they're not the same thing. The period is not, I say again, the period is not this. The period is a number. It is a distance. The period is 2 pi. There is what's called the standard interval. The standard interval is the interval from 0 to 2 pi. Usually you include 0 and usually you do not include 2 pi. So that would correspond to, if we had the unit circle here again, that would correspond to every point on the unit circle, on the circumference of the unit circle, every point used exactly once. If I had closed interval here, that means this point is getting used twice, and for some technical reasons later on, we don't want to allow that. And so we have closed interval at 0, open interval at 2 pi. So you do include 0, you do not include 2 pi. So that is the standard interval. All right? Now, we also have the axis. Now, the axis we'll leave off for just a moment. That's one of the key notions, but I'm going to put that on the back burner for a minute. We also have the peak and we have the trough. Trough is one of those weird words in English with the weird spelling if you're not a native speaker. There's the peak and the trough. Peak and the trough. All right? Peak is the highest point on the curve. Pi over 2 is where the peak occurs. The peak is 1. The peak is 1. This peak is 1. This trough value is the minimum. Trough value is -1. Trough value is -1 within the limits of my bad picture. And then we have what's called the peak line. Actually, the peak line is a little bit more use than the peaks themselves. The peak line is the line that passes through all the peaks. That's the peak line. And then we have the trough line. The trough line is the line that passes through all the troughs within the limits of my very badly drawn picture. There's the peak line, there's the trough line. The line that is midway between those two, the line that is midway between the peak line and the trough line is the axis. In this particular case, the axis coincidentally corresponds to the x-axis. That is not always the case. It is not always the case that the axis of the curve corresponds to the x-axis. It does in this case, and that is a coincidence. The axis does not, I say again, not, it does not always correspond to the x-axis. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. In the basic case, it does. It's just the same thing as, does the vertex of a parabola always pass through the origin? Well, no. The vertex of the basic parabola does, but not all of them. So, the axis of the basic shape sine curve is the same as the x-axis, but that is not always the case. So the peak is the line connecting the peaks, the peak line. The trough line connects the troughs, and then the axis is the line midway between them. And then we have another piece of terminology. We have the amplitude. And that's a key notion, the amplitude. The amplitude is the distance between the peak line and the axis. The amplitude is the distance between the peak line and the axis. Notice it is also this distance. This is also the amplitude. But the amplitude is the distance between the peak line and the axis. All right? So we have all these pieces of terminology. We have a function is periodic if it repeats itself. The period is the minimum distance required to repeat itself. The standard interval, in this case, the standard interval for the sine curve is from 0 to 2 pi. You include 0, but do not include 2 pi. The peak line is the line that connects the peaks. The trough line is the line that connects the troughs. The axis is the line that is midway between them. And then the amplitude is the distance between, not between peak and trough, it's between peak and axis. That's the amplitude. And so those are the basic terminology, some of the information, some of the language that we use when we talk about the sine curve.